The moon of Zorath hung silent in the void, a dark sentinel orbiting its home planet, bathed in the dim light of distant stars. The Zorathian warship, an imposing structure of jagged steel and alien design, floated ominously above it. On board, there was no sound except the occasional hum of alien machinery. The ship's purpose was clear: war, conquest, and the unrelenting drive to expand the Zorathian Empire. And today it had a new prize: human children. The humans who had been captured during the raid on the space station had been locked away in cells at the lower levels of the warship. They were scared, confused, and disoriented, their minds still trying to grasp the brutal reality of their situation. They had been taken in the dead of night, ripped from their families, their homes, and thrust into the cold, unforgiving universe. But among them there was one who seemed strangely calm: Jake. At 15, Jake was the oldest of the children. He had dark brown hair, sharp eyes, and a presence that suggested he was more than just another lost kid. There was something in his gaze, a depth that the others didn't share, as though he knew something they didn't. His clothes were torn and his body bruised from the harrowing capture, but he walked with a kind of quiet defiance that suggested he wouldn't break easily. He sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor of his cell, his eyes tracing the faint glow of the lights in the hallway outside. His mind was racing, thinking, planning. The Zorathians had underestimated them, he was sure of it. They thought that by capturing children they had won some victory. They had no idea what they had truly set in motion. "Jake!" a voice whispered, breaking the silence. It was Sarah, a girl no older than 10, her face pale and her small hands trembling. Are you thinking of a way out?" Jake looked over at her and smiled softly. "I'm always thinking of a way out. It's what keeps us alive." The other children huddled in their cells, trying to stay close for comfort despite the walls between them. Most of them were younger, and fear was etched into their faces. They didn't understand the gravity of their situation, nor the strange, inexplicable power that Jake felt stirring within him. But Jake did. And that was why he couldn't just sit here, waiting for someone else to rescue them. There was a much bigger picture at play. The Zorathians thought they were just human children, weak, defenseless, and powerless. But what they didn't know was that these children were anything but ordinary. Jake could feel it, deep in his bones. Something had changed in the air. It was as though the universe itself was shifting, awakening something inside them. Something ancient, something powerful. The next few hours passed in a haze of half-sleep and moments of sharp alertness as the children tried to get comfortable in their cells. The ship was quiet, except for the occasional sound of Zorathian guards passing by. They were the only real threat right now, but Jake knew it wouldn't be long before their presence became an annoyance. The Zorathians weren't used to human resistance. They had captured thousands of species throughout their history, and humans had never proven to be anything but weak prey. The children's spirits were already starting to break. But Jake knew they had to hold on. They were not weak, and they were not prey. Jake stood up, his mind whirling with plans. He moved silently toward the bars of his cell and peered out into the corridor. A single Zorathian guard stood at the far end, his glowing eyes scanning the dark hallways, unaware of the humans within his grasp. Jake could feel a surge of energy within him, a hum beneath his skin that pulsed in time with the Zorathian's movements. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Jake could sense the shift. The guard walked past his cell, muttering something in his harsh alien language. Jake's eyes narrowed. There was something familiar about the way the guard moved, something off, as if the very air around him was charged, reacting to his presence. He stepped back from the bars, the hum growing louder. The guard passed by, but Jake's senses were alive with the knowledge that something was happening here, something big. He turned back to Sarah, who had been watching him closely. She was scared, but there was something about her that had always made Jake feel like she was more than just a frightened child. Sarah had an intelligence to her, a sharpness that most kids her age didn't possess. "Sarah," Jake whispered, "there's something happening on this ship. I can feel it, something strange." She nodded slowly, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Jake's mind raced. He couldn't explain it in words, at least not yet. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The Zorathians hadn't just captured them for ransom or labor. No, this was more than that. The Zorathians had been after something specific. "Stay alert," Jake muttered. "We need to figure out what they're really doing here." The hours stretched on and the children began to fall asleep, one by one. Jake remained awake, his mind ever vigilant. He had a plan. It was still incomplete, but it was there. He knew that if they didn't act soon, they would be lost. The Zorathians would break them, either by force or through their strange experiments. Jake wasn't sure which was worse, but he had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. The ship's structure was strange to him, unlike anything he had ever seen, but Jake was resourceful. He had spent years learning about alien technology, hacking into systems on the black market and studying the designs of various alien races. He knew enough to get them out of here. But there was something else, a feeling, a deep primal sense that something was drawing him toward the ship's central core. It wasn't until the following day that Jake finally discovered the truth. He had managed to slip out of his cell using a makeshift tool he had fashioned from the scraps of his environment. The halls of the warship were eerily silent, the air thick with the stench of metal and synthetic dust. Jake moved with purpose, his footsteps light and his senses heightened. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he would recognize it when he found it. He crept into a corridor that he hadn't seen before, a darkened hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly. As he walked deeper into the ship's bowels, the air grew colder. Jake's heart began to race as he sensed something, or someone, watching him. At the end of the hallway he found a door. It was sealed tightly, but Jake could feel a presence beyond it. He pressed his ear to the cold metal and listened. There was something. On the other side, voices, mechanical sounds, and something else, something far more primal. He pulled out his tool and worked quickly to override the security system. The door hissed open, revealing a large chamber. The lights inside flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. What he saw inside made his stomach twist with dread. There, in the center of the room, were dozens of containers, each holding a human child. They were suspended in strange, liquid-filled pods, their bodies connected to a web of wires and tubes. It was clear that the Zorathians had been experimenting on them. But what struck Jake the most was the sight of one of the children's eyes flickering open, the strange energy within them pulsing. The child's face was pale, but there was something inside them, a power, a force. Jake could feel it. It was the same force that had been awakening in him, and it was growing stronger. He took a step back, his breath caught in his throat. The Zorathians had been searching for something, but they had no idea what they had unleashed. These children were no longer just human. They were something far more dangerous. Hell, Jake knew then that their survival depended on more than just escaping. It was about understanding what the Zorathians had stumbled upon. Whatever it was, it had to be controlled before it consumed them all. Jake returned to the others, his mind racing. He couldn't tell them everything, not yet. But he knew one thing for certain. This warship and everything it stood for had just signed its own death warrant. And it was only a matter of time before they all learned why. The Zorathian warship was massive, a testament to the Empire's relentless quest for power. Its metallic hull shimmered in the emptiness of space, a terrifying beast ready to strike down anything in its path. Within its cold walls, fear permeated the air. The captured human children, imprisoned in their cells, could sense it, each of them acutely aware of the ship's looming, oppressive presence. Jake, the oldest among them, stood apart. While the others were consumed with the overwhelming terror of their captivity, Jake was focused. There was something alive within him now, a pulsing force, a power he could feel but not yet control. He knew it wasn't just him. The others had it too. He could feel it in the air, in the faint whispers of movement in the dark. For days Jake had kept to himself, observing, calculating. He had already planned their escape, but something kept him from acting, something powerful, something he needed to understand. The Zorathians hadn't captured them for their skills or knowledge. They had something far more insidious in mind. "Jake!" whispered Sarah, the youngest among the children. Her small brown eyes looked up at him, wide with fear and curiosity. "Are we going to get out of here?" asked Reggie. Jake smiled faintly, though it was more a grimace than reassurance. "Yes, we'll get out of here. But we need to be patient. They've made a mistake by capturing us. They don't know what we are." Sarah frowned, but the spark of hope in her eyes never dimmed. She had an unwavering faith in Jake, perhaps because he was the only one who seemed certain of their escape. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the Zorathians had underestimated them, and that this ignorance would be their undoing. The day passed slowly. The ship's harsh fluorescent lighting illuminated the endless hallways, casting long, unnerving shadows across the metal walls. The guards patrolled the ship in regular intervals, their cold, alien faces impassive as they passed by the children's cells. Jake was hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. He had no idea how much time had passed, but he knew that the moment would come when they would have to act. He spent hours thinking, calculating, trying to make sense of the strange energy coursing through him. It wasn't just the adrenaline of their captivity. It was something deeper, something primal. At first he thought it was a trick of his mind, a byproduct of the fear and isolation. But as the days wore on, the power became undeniable. He sat down, legs crossed, focusing on his breathing. He closed his eyes and concentrated on the sensations inside him. His heart pounded, the blood rushing through his veins. Then, beneath the rhythmic pulse, he felt it, a faint hum that vibrated in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't painful, but it was disorienting, like something was awakening deep within him. He reached out mentally, trying to focus on the sensation. At first there was nothing, but then, just at the edge of his awareness, he felt it again. The hum. It was coming from the others. He didn't need to see them to know that the children were experiencing the same thing. Sarah, with her wide, innocent eyes, had it. Emily, a quiet 13-year-old, had it too. Even young Marcus, who had barely said a word since the raid, was pulsing with it. The energy was shared, unspoken, and now undeniable. Jake's eyes snapped open. He could no longer ignore it. Something inside him, inside all of them, was changing. "Jake, what's happening to us?" Sarah asked again, her voice trembling with the same mixture of fear and fascination that he felt. Jake turned to her, taking a deep breath. "You mean we're not just regular kids?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake shook his head. "No, we've always been more, and now the power inside us is waking up." The word power hung heavily in the air. Sarah didn't ask more questions, but her curiosity was visible, her young face filled with the need for answers. "You feel it?" Jake asked her, his voice low. "That hum in your chest? The way the air feels thick and electric? It's not just fear. It's something else, something that's tied to us. I think they're experimenting on us, trying to awaken it." Sarah nodded slowly. "I can feel it. I thought it was just me. I was afraid." Jake smiled grimly. "It's not just you, it's all of us." Later that night, when the guards had passed and the ship had settled into an uneasy stillness, Jake stood in front of his cell bars, his mind working. There had to be a way to harness this energy. If they were going to escape, they needed to understand this new power and control it before the Zorathians did. But how? He began to experiment, focusing on the hum within him. The energy was like an invisible thread that connected him to something larger, something beyond the confines of his body. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel its pull. Slowly, he extended his hand toward the wall of his cell. His fingers tingled, the air around him thickening with static. Then, with a jolt, the wall before him rippled, as though the energy had woven through the atoms and shifted their position. Jake pulled his hand back, shocked by what had just happened. It was like a burst of energy had connected him to the wall. He had moved something, physically altered the space around him, just with his mind. His chest tightened with excitement and fear. This wasn't just some figment of his imagination. The power was real. And it wasn't just him. As he turned to look at Sarah, he saw that her hand was glowing faintly, her own energy rising. "Sarah," Jake whispered, "can you feel it? The energy?" She nodded, eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and wonder. "I can feel it. It's like electricity, but different." Jake nodded slowly. "We have to learn to control it. If we're going to escape, we need to understand what's happening." He started. The next few days were filled with secret training sessions. Jake had no formal plan, but his instincts told him to start small, to experiment, to test the limits of their abilities. He began by guiding Sarah and the others through basic exercises, focusing on the hum, learning to direct the energy, and seeing if they could manipulate small objects in their cells. Sarah, with her natural curiosity, was the first to show real promise. She focused intently on a small scrap of metal, willing it to move. At first, nothing happened, but then, with a soft click, the metal piece levitated off the floor, spinning in midair. Her face lit up with excitement. But Jake knew that this was only the beginning. They had to push further. They had to understand what they were dealing with. Each night they experimented more. Subtle movements at first, then larger actions. Emily could create flashes of light with a snap of her fingers, while Marcus, the quiet one, could create bursts of force that sent objects crashing into the walls. As their powers grew, so did their understanding of them. Jake began to realize that this wasn't just telekinesis or telepathy or anything he could easily classify. It was something deeper, something primal, and it was tied to their very essence. It was like the universe itself had marked them for something greater. Days turned into weeks. The Zorathians, unaware of the growing power of their prisoners, continued their experiments. They never suspected that the children had become more than they had ever anticipated. But Jake could feel it. The moment was coming. Soon, they would be ready to escape. Jake stood before the others in the dead of night, his heart pounding with purpose. "We're ready. It's time." The hum in his chest had never been louder, and with it, he knew, the Zorathians' death warrant had already been signed. The warship hummed with cold efficiency, its core systems alive with a symphony of alien technology. The Zorathians aboard it moved through their routines, unaware of the storm brewing within the lower decks. For centuries, their kind had prided themselves on their dominion over lesser species. The humans they had captured were an afterthought, a curiosity for study, a bargaining chip for future negotiations. They had no idea what they had unleashed. Jake stood at the edge of his cell, his breathing slow and steady. The faint hum of energy within him had grown stronger, more defined, until it felt like a living thing. It coursed through his veins, whispered in his thoughts, and tugged at the edges of his consciousness. Around him, the others, Sarah, Emily, Marcus, and the other children, were beginning to stir with the same awareness. Their fear had dulled, replaced by something deeper, purpose. "Are you sure about this?" Emily whispered, her hands glowing faintly as she channeled her energy into practice. "If they catch us before we're ready—" "They won't," Jake interrupted, his voice steady and calm. "We're ready now. It's time to show them who we really are." "What devils?" The children exchanged nervous glances, but no one protested. Over the past weeks, Jake had become their leader, their guide in this strange new reality. He had given them hope when all seemed lost, and now he was giving them something even more powerful, a plan. Jake had pieced together the layout of the ship from the guards' movements and the fragments of alien technology he had managed to decipher. The Zorathians were meticulous, but they had grown complacent. They believed the children were too weak to fight back, and that belief would be their downfall. The heart of the warship was its central core, a massive chamber that housed the ship's power source and its command systems. Jake's plan was simple in its boldness. They would disrupt the core, incapacitating the ship long enough to escape. But Jake had another reason for targeting the core, one he hadn't shared with the others. He had sensed something there, something that pulsed with the same energy coursing through him. It was as if the ship itself was alive, and Jake intended to find out why. The children worked quickly, their powers honed through weeks of practice. Jake had assigned each of them a role, ensuring that every part of the plan was covered. Sarah, with her keen sense of spatial awareness, would lead the group through the labyrinthine corridors. Emily, whose light-based abilities had become more refined, would serve as their distraction, creating illusions to confuse the guards. Marcus, with his raw strength, would handle any physical barriers they encountered. Jake's role was the most dangerous. He would confront the core directly, using the full extent of his newfound abilities to destabilize it. He didn't know if it would work, but he had no other choice. As they prepared to move, Jake turned to the group, his voice low but firm. "Remember, this isn't just about us. If we don't stop them, they'll keep taking more kids. They'll keep experimenting. We can't let that happen." The children nodded, their faces pale but determined. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. There was no turning back. The journey to the core was both harrowing and exhilarating. The children moved through the ship with an eerie precision, their powers working in perfect harmony. Sarah led the way, her enhanced senses allowing her to navigate the corridors with ease. When they encountered guards, Emily created dazzling illusions, leading the Zorathians away from their path. Marcus used his strength to disable security doors, the metal groaning under his hands as he forced them open. Jake stayed at the rear, his senses on high alert. The hum of energy within him was growing louder, more insistent, as they approached the core. He could feel it now, a pulsing presence that seemed to resonate with his very being. It was as if the ship itself was calling to him. When they finally reached the core chamber, they paused, their breaths ragged but their resolve unshaken. The door before them was massive, its surface etched with alien symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Jake placed his hand against the door, the energy within him surging in response. "It's here," he murmured, more to himself than the others. "This is it." The door hissed open, revealing the core chamber in all its alien splendor. The room was vast, its walls lined with intricate machinery that pulsed with a faint blue light. At the center of the chamber was the core itself, a massive spherical structure that floated in midair, its surface crackling with arcs of energy. But it wasn't just the core that drew Jake's attention. Around it were dozens of containment pods, similar to the ones he had seen earlier. Each pod held a child, their bodies suspended in a strange, glowing liquid. Their eyes were closed, but their faces were peaceful, as if they were dreaming. Jake's heart clenched at the sight. The Zorathians weren't just experimenting on the children, they were using them to power the ship. The realization hit him like a blow, and his resolve hardened. "They're using them," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with anger. "They're draining them." Jake nodded, his fists clenched. Not for much longer. Before they could act, the Zorathians arrived. The guards entered the chamber in force, their weapons trained on the children. At the front of the group was a tall, imposing figure, one of the Zorathian commanders. His eyes glowed with a cold, calculating intelligence as he regarded the children. "You've made it farther than I expected," the commander said, his voice a low, guttural growl. "But your defiance ends here." Jake stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You made a mistake when you took us. You thought we were just kids, but we're more than that. And now, you're going to pay for what you've done." The commander laughed, a cruel, grating sound. "You think you can challenge us? You're nothing but experiments, tools for our empire. You don't even understand the power you wield." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Maybe not, but I'm about to find out." With a surge of energy, Jake unleashed his power. The air around him crackled with electricity as the heme within him erupted into a full-blown roar. The other children followed his lead, their abilities flaring to life as they faced the Zorathians. Sarah used her spatial awareness to disorient the guards, creating illusions of herself that darted around the room. Emily's light-based powers blinded their enemies, while Marcus sent shockwaves through the floor, throwing the guards off balance. Jake focused on the commander, their powers colliding in a blinding flash of light. The Zorathian was strong, but Jake's resolve was stronger. He could feel the core's energy resonating with his own, amplifying his abilities. As the battle raged, Jake's mind reached out to the children in the pods. He could feel their presence, their latent energy waiting to be awakened. With a final surge of power, he directed his energy toward the pods, shattering the containment systems and freeing the children within. The freed children joined the fight, their powers unleashed in a chaotic, beautiful display. The Zorathians, unprepared for the sheer force of their combined abilities, began to falter. One by one, the guards fell, until only the commander remained. Jake faced him, his body glowing with energy. "You thought you could use us. You thought we were weak, but you were wrong." With a final burst of power, Jake unleashed a wave of energy that sent the commander crashing into the core. The sphere crackled and sparked before imploding, its energy dissipating into the air. The ship shuddered as its systems began to fail, the lights flickering ominously. Jake turned to the others, his voice firm. "We need to get out of here. Now." The children moved quickly, their powers guiding them through the chaos. The ship was falling apart around them, but they didn't stop. They had come too far to fail now. When they finally reached the escape pods, Jake turned to the group, his gaze steady. "We did it. We're free." As the escape pods launched into the void, the children watched as the warship imploded behind them, a brilliant explosion of light and energy that illuminated the darkness of space. They had won. But Jake knew their journey was far from over.